The role of unions and collective bargaining. There's been a lot of talk about how unions have brought us so many wonderful things: better wages, better working hours, better working conditions, control of the workplace, days off, vacations, abolition of child labor, and medical and other benefits. And so let's simplify this whole debate by treating all of these things as a single entity. We'll call it compensation. All of these things are just forms of compensation. It's also important to know that there is no correct or just wage for any task. What we call a job is nothing more than an extended trade, a trade of resources for a series of tasks performed, like a plumber or a lawyer on retainer. So, in a strict sense, nobody really has a job, so to speak. They're just engaging in a long-term trade with a single trade partner, and that trade being a task for resources traded by the medium of exchange of money. Now, I'm going to show you in a very simple way how it is virtually impossible that unions are responsible for the increases in compensation for people with real jobs. Exhibit 1. The after-tax profit of corporations has run roughly 6% annually for, I'll say, quite some time. I believe there are charts that show this going back to 1947, and I don't know how far back this really goes, but I assume it goes back to like 1776, or at least it doesn't deviate too wildly. Not that it would matter, though, because of what's in Exhibit 2. That is real compensation per hour. Not just wages, like those you see in downward charts, but total compensation. A lot of people will do is they'll show how real wages have declined. And say, see, we're getting poorer, but really, if you include all the other forms of compensation, it's been going up. We can also look at food expenditures as a percentage of disposable income, and things like this, like the price of eggs. And food, clothing, and housing expenditures as a percentage of household income has also gone down. So clearly, real income, or real compensation, has gone up by at least 100% since 1940. But how can unions be responsible for this when after-tax profits of corporations, after-tax profit as a percentage of GDP for the entire economy is only 6%? Firms only have about 6% extra that they can theoretically pay their workers in the forms of wages, lower work hours, or any other form of compensation, right? That's the buffer zone. Even if we assume that none of the profit is reinvested, that none of it goes to small-time shareholders, and that it all goes to mansions and yachts for the rich and the famous, it's still only 6%. And in 2 years of 3% economic growth, that all gets completely negated. And so we just analytically, we know with certainty that there is no possible way that unions could be responsible for the increase in compensation for work. My argument isn't merely that unions did not cause the increase in compensation. I'm saying that they could not have. Now, I could end this video here. Fundamentally, that's all you need to know. But I think it would be useful to explicate a few exchanges just so people can get a better understanding of how this works in practice. Let's say you have some machinists working for money. They're working 12 hours a day. The firm earns about 6% profit. They then decide that they only want to work 8 hours a day instead of 12 hours a day. And so what will happen is that the fixed cost of the firm will remain the same. But the hours worked by the workers will decline by 1/3. Okay. So odds are, and 1/3, that's 33.3%. So odds are that company will go out of business unless they can really lower the variable costs a lot, which they probably can't lower the variable costs that much. But and so in all likelihood, that firm will go out of business if the workers demand an 8-hour day. But let's say the company is earning 15% profits. This is a highly profitable company, and the workers want a 10-hour day instead of a 12-hour day. And so that would be a 16% reduction in their working time. Well, the variable costs will fall, and perhaps the workers will be a little bit more efficient with each hour worked, so it won't be a 16% reduction in total output, and so the firm can still remain profitable. And so that bargain can take place. But as you can see, moving from the 12-hour day to the 10-hour day required the firm to become more profitable. And how did the firm become more profitable? Well, by each worker becoming more productive. So while yes, the workers needed to either strike or preferably negotiate without a strike for the 10-hour day, right? They had to actually do that. The 10-hour day only became possible through increased productivity. And so when you go from the 10-hour day to the 8-hour day, that's the same thing. So with all of these other forms of compensation, right, the same thing with that. Yes, it required that workers, bargain. Right? You have to bargain. And that bargaining can come in the form of a negotiation or a strike. So I want to make it clear that I am not against collective bargaining any more than I'm against haggling in a marketplace. And that is why real wages rose. Technology, or real compensation, rose. Technology increased the productivity of workers, giving them more to bargain with. But you cannot bargain for resources that simply aren't there. And this is clearly illustrated with child labor laws. Why is it that child labor laws happen to be imposed after a certain point? Why didn't we have child labor laws around 1000 BC? Or how about in the 1870s? Did people in the 1870s just not care about their children? Moreover, why weren't child labor laws prevalent at any time before the Industrial Revolution? Why did it take an exponential leap in productivity to no longer require children to work, which we could see as a form of compensation? Well, to ask the question is to answer it, right? Moreover, child labor laws had a negligible effect on actually preventing child labor. Because think about it. Families had their children employed because they were so poor that every cent counted to put food on the table. And as productivity and hence real wages or real compensation rose, parents could afford to take their children out of the workforce and into schools. The notion that child labor was rampant before the state stepped in like the hand of God to stop it, that's another statist mythology. But what about, say, the family that needs their children to work in order to put food on the table, and they need this after child labor laws have already been passed? Well, they're in kind of a pickle. A response might be, well, we can use the state to fund their children, to give them a little bit of welfare so their children don't have to work. Right? And that would be subsidizing reproduction of poor people, and we could say poor people who have irresponsible reproduction habits. Right? So you would be subsidizing that and rewarding that. Or you can say, well, we can take money from the capitalists. Right? That 6% they're taking off the top, that can all go to these families. And what that would do is not only subsidize lower class reproduction, but punish the very process of industrialization that is responsible for child labor even being an issue in the first place. Now, what I mean by it even being an issue in the first place is that prior to industry, there was no such thing as child labor. It was just called life. You worked. That was it. The only reason that this is even becoming an issue is because productivity has increased so much that families can afford to not have their children work as soon as they are able. It was the rise in productivity that opened up the possibility of ending child labor in the first place. Same story with every other form of compensation. Those who claim unions are responsible for the rise in compensation are putting the cart before the horse. So when looking at the massive rise in standard of living, I'm thinking, where is the next round of standard of living improvements going to come from? Is it going to come from that 6% that all the capitalists are taking off the top? And certainly not. And while you can show how all of the wealth is concentrated, what does that even mean? And a lot of people talk about, well, wealth is really concentrated. 1% of the population owns 50% of, whatever. So let's take a factory owner who employs 1,000 people, okay? And let's just analyze this situation of the factory owner and 1,000 people. Let's just pretend they're the entire planet or something, okay? In this situation, the factory owner probably owns more wealth than the 1,000 people that he employs. right? Because a factory is quite expensive, and all the people he employs are, living probably a little bit better than paycheck to paycheck. I mean, machinists and industrial workers actually tend to earn a little bit more than the average worker, but we could safely say that the factory owner has more wealth than all of his 1,000 employees combined, or something pretty close. Does this mean he lives off of 1,000 times as much stuff? That he consumes 1,000 times as much resources in his gluttony of living? No. All he lives off of is a portion of the profits from his wealth. And, the capitalist, he typically works more hours than the typical line worker. And so one man has all this wealth, but so what? Right? It's not liquid. It's not it's not like he's living off of all of these resources. Now, so far I've been talking about reality-based and productivity-based unions. Well, what about state employee unions? Well, state employee unions, this requires far less nuance to state my position on this. State employee unions are a complete abomination and requiem knell of the rot of any society that has them. To explain why, we must first recognize that state employees are not tied to any productive work. Right? In theory, you could pay people to dig holes and fill them up again, because you're just getting you're just taxing resources, and you're taking money from taxation, and the state can, in theory, spend it on whatever they want. Now, they may suffer a little bit from elections, but even elections are kind of, democracy doesn't work as a rational ignorance, package deals. I don't want to get into that here, but democracy is a very poor regulatory mechanism on what the state spends money on. If the state was doing something so bald as paying people to dig holes and fill them up, probably those bums would be thrown out of office and the programs ended. But democracy doesn't really regulate effectively what the state spends money on, right? And so in theory, you could pay people to dig holes and fill them up again. Of course, teachers are providing value, right? Well, let's see. So you're required to attend a series of classes by law. All right, that's already a bad sign. Now, these classes that you go to, they are lectures, and they are lectures which you can't pause, right? There's no pause button. You can't rewind them, and which you can only see once at a certain time each day. Actually, no, you can only see one lecture at one time, like ever, because they're all different, because they all have a progression. Now, you can ask questions in these classes, but you can also ask questions if you had a tutor. Let's say there was a system with some video lectures, some standardized tests, and a few tutors on hand. Like you had people go into a room, they had all these computers set up, all these video lectures. If they had questions, they'd go ask a tutor. Imagine how much better we would do in this system. And so while the charade of having a person stand in front of the kids, this is all pre-video nonsense. What did you say? Well, please save your questions until the end. Imagine just being able to rewind it like you can with a free video on YouTube. So why do we have this system? Well, because the state doesn't have to compete. This system was instantiated before easy access to video, and state programs are semi-static because they don't have to get customers. So they have zero incentive to change it. Now, usually at the beginning, state programs are actually a little bit more efficient because at the beginning of their instantiation, a lot of central planners look at the market, see what the market is doing, and then say, all right, so we'll have a state program that works like that. But after that program is already instantiated, why change? And even, quote, private, close quote, schools are hamstrung and have to follow the same basic model of, quote, public, close quote, schools. Now, these obsolete teachers are striking because they want to collectively bargain. The ability of state workers to collectively bargain is not tied in any way to their actual productivity like it is in other industries, or like it is in industry, real work. Okay, these state workers, they live in a bizarre world of taxation instantiation. It's not connected, it's not calibrated. So now teachers are obviously the most absurd example of this, but how much should policemen and firemen be paid? Now, I happen to believe that you can have all these public services, roads, police, fire protection, schooling, that you can have all of these in the absence of a state, and that these services can be provided for free to the destitute, but that is not the point of this video. With state employees, there's no horse. It's just a cart. Cops should get paid more. Why? Are firms and communes willing to pay more for police services because the productivity of each policeman has increased? NA, not available. Division by zero. There is no market test. There is no calibration. Any demands the state employee unions make have virtually no connection to the productivity because the state itself has virtually no connection to productivity. And that is why state employees, I think they shouldn't exist at all, but at least they should not be allowed to collectively bargain.